When Sarah Fletcher moved into the abandoned farmhouse on Elm Creek Road, she thought the scratches covering every wall were just damage from neglect. Deep gouges carved into wood and plaster, forming strange patterns that hurt to look at directly. But on her first night in the house, she heard the scratching begin again. Slow, deliberate marks being carved into the walls around her bedroom. When morning came, she found fresh words gouged into the wall beside her bed. "Welcome home, Sarah. We've been waiting for you to complete our family." The Fletcher farmhouse had stood empty for 3 years when Sarah inherited it from her great-aunt in 1916. Located 15 miles outside Cedar Rapids, the 2-story home sat on 40 acres of rich Iowa farmland that should have been worth a fortune. But nobody wanted to buy the Fletcher place, not after what happened to the family who lived there. Sarah knew the basic story. In 1913, her great-aunt's family had vanished without explanation. Robert Fletcher, his wife Helen, and their 3 children had simply disappeared one winter night, leaving behind a house full of untouched belongings and walls covered in thousands of mysterious scratches. Local authorities assumed the family had fled some kind of financial trouble, but they couldn't explain why the Fletchers had left behind their money, their clothes, even their winter coats in the middle of January, or why every room in the house looked like wild animals had clawed at the walls for months. Sarah was a practical woman of 28 who didn't believe in ghost stories. She needed a place to live after her divorce, and the farmhouse was free. The scratched walls could be covered with fresh paint and wallpaper. The isolation didn't bother her. After years of marriage to a man who controlled every aspect of her life, Sarah craved solitude. She moved in on a gray October morning, bringing only 2 suitcases and her determination to start over. The house smelled of dust and neglect, but the bones of the structure were solid. With some work, it could be beautiful again. Sarah spent her first day cleaning and exploring. The scratches were worse than she'd expected. They covered every surface like some kind of primitive language. Long parallel lines intersected with short marks and curved symbols that almost looked like letters. In the children's bedroom, the scratches were smaller and more frantic, as if made by tiny hands. But it was the pattern that bothered her most. The scratches weren't random. They formed deliberate designs that seemed to flow from room to room, connected by thin lines that ran along baseboards and around door frames. Like a massive message written in a code she couldn't understand. That evening, Sarah sat in the kitchen eating canned soup by lamplight. The electricity had been disconnected years ago, and she hadn't arranged to have it restored yet. The house creaked and settled around her. Normal sounds for an old building. She tried to ignore the way the scratches on the walls seemed to move in the flickering light. Around midnight, she heard the first scraping sound. It came from somewhere above her head, in the direction of the master bedroom. A slow, rhythmic scratching, like fingernails dragging across wood. Sarah grabbed her lamp and climbed the stairs, following the sound down the hallway. The scratching stopped as soon as she reached the bedroom door. Sarah held her lamp high, examining the walls. The scratches looked exactly as they had during the day. No new marks, no signs of disturbance. But as she turned to leave, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. One section of scratches near the window had changed. What had been random lines that morning now clearly spelled out words, "Sarah's here." "Tell the others." She convinced herself it was a trick of the lamplight. Old wood and shadows could play strange tricks on tired eyes, but sleep didn't come easily that night, and every small sound made her jump. The next morning brought no relief. Fresh scratches covered the wall beside her bed, carved deep into the wood with surgical precision. They formed a message in clear, careful letters. "Robert wants to meet you. Helen says you have mother's eyes. The children are excited to have a new sister." Sarah's hands shook as she traced the fresh gouges with her finger. The wood was still rough, splinters catching on her skin. These marks were new, made while she slept just inches away. A rational person would have left immediately, but Sarah had nowhere else to go, and the alternative was returning to her former life of dependence and control. She decided to stay and solve the mystery of the scratched messages. She spent the day in Cedar Rapids, researching the Fletcher family at the local library. What she found chilled her more than any ghost story. Robert Fletcher had been a farmer and amateur photographer who documented everything about his family's daily life. The library's archives contained dozens of his photographs, showing a normal farming family going about their routine. But something was wrong with the images. In every photograph, the family members' hands were covered in bandages. Even the children, as young as 5 and 7, wore white cloth wrapped around their fingers and palms. When Sarah asked the librarian about it, the elderly woman's expression grew troubled. Robert claimed his family suffered from a rare skin condition that made their hands crack and bleed, she said. But some folks thought different. There were reports about sounds coming from the Fletcher place at all hours, scratching and scraping that went on for days at a time. What kind of sounds? Like someone was trying to claw their way out of something, or maybe into something. The neighbors complained, but Robert always had explanations, said it was just the children playing or repairs he was making to the house. The librarian pulled out a final photograph that made Sarah's stomach drop. It showed the Fletcher family standing in front of their farmhouse, but the walls behind them were already covered in scratches. Thousands of marks that formed intricate patterns across every visible surface. "This was taken just weeks before they disappeared," the librarian whispered. "Look at their faces." Sarah looked closer and saw what the woman meant. The family wasn't smiling. Their eyes held a strange intensity, almost feverish, and their bandaged hands were positioned as if they were scratching at invisible surfaces even while posing for the camera. "There's something else," the librarian said, glancing around to make sure they were alone. "My grandfather was one of the men who searched the house after the family vanished. He said the scratches were still fresh when they found it empty, like the scratching had continued for days after the Fletchers disappeared." That night, Sarah returned to the farmhouse with new understanding and growing dread. She wasn't dealing with a simple haunting. Something had happened to the Fletcher family, something that had driven them to scratch at the walls until their hands bled. And now it was happening to her. She tried to stay awake, determined to catch whatever was making the marks, but exhaustion won, and she fell asleep in the kitchen chair around 3 in the morning. The scratching woke her at dawn. This time it wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from inside them. Sarah pressed her ear against the wooden panels and heard it clearly. Multiple sources of scratching, all working at once, like several people trapped inside the house's frame, clawing desperately at the interior walls. The sounds moved through the house as she followed them, up the stairs, along the hallway, into each bedroom. Always just behind the surface she was listening to, always just out of reach. When the scratching finally stopped, Sarah found new messages covering every wall she'd examined. But these weren't carved into the wood. They were scratched into the wallpaper from underneath, as if someone inside the walls was trying to communicate with her. "We're still here, Sarah. We never left. The scratching is how we talk now, how we remember who we were. Join us. It doesn't hurt after the first day. Your hands heal stronger. Your nails grow long and sharp. The house needs a family. We've been incomplete without you. Mother said you would come eventually. If you're fascinated by this terrifying tale of a family trapped between worlds, make sure to subscribe. Because what happened next will change everything you thought you knew about the Fletcher house and the price of belonging to something that should have stayed buried." Sarah ran from the house that morning and drove straight to the Cedar Rapids police station. She tried to explain about the messages and the scratching sounds, but the officers looked at her like she was having a breakdown. One suggested she might be experiencing stress from her recent divorce and recommended she see a doctor. But when Sarah rolled up her sleeves to gesture while talking, everyone in the room fell silent. Her hands were covered in fresh scratches, deep gouges that ran from her wrists to her fingertips, as if she'd been clawing at something rough all night. She had no memory of making them. The police drove out to the farmhouse to investigate. They found Sarah's belongings exactly as she'd left them, but the walls told a different story. Fresh scratches covered every surface, forming elaborate patterns that connected all the old marks into one massive design. When they looked closer, the officers realized the new scratches weren't random either. They formed words and sentences, but not in English. The message was written in a strange script that looked almost like claw marks arranged into letters. One of the officers had studied Latin in college. He spent an hour working out the translation of one section near the front door. When he finished, his face had gone pale. "What does it say?" Sarah asked. "It says, 'The scratching teaches us patience. The scratching teaches us unity. The scratching makes us family. Sarah will learn as we learned. Sarah will scratch as we scratch. Sarah will stay as we stayed.'" The officers sealed the house and recommended Sarah find somewhere else to live immediately. But that night, lying in a motel bed 20 miles away, Sarah woke to the sound of scratching. It was coming from the walls of the motel room. Faint at first, then louder and more insistent. Other guests in nearby rooms began complaining about the noise. The motel manager found scratches appearing on walls throughout the building, fresh marks that seemed to follow Sarah's location. She tried staying with friends, but the scratching followed her everywhere. Hotels, apartments, even a hospital where doctors tried to treat what they assumed was a psychological breakdown. Wherever Sarah went, the walls began to speak in the Fletcher family's scratched language. The messages grew more urgent. "Come home. We're waiting. The house is lonely without you." After 2 weeks of running, Sarah finally understood the truth. The Fletcher family hadn't disappeared. They had become part of the house itself, absorbed into its structure in some way that allowed them to communicate only through scratching. And they had been waiting for her, their last living relative, to complete their trapped existence. Sarah returned to the farmhouse on a cold November night. The scratches on the walls had multiplied during her absence, covering every inch of space with intricate patterns. But now she could read them. The meaning was clear, as if the strange script had become a second language. "Welcome home, daughter. Welcome home, sister. Welcome home, family." Her hands began to itch as soon as she stepped inside. By morning, her fingernails had grown long and sharp. Her palms bled from scratching at the walls, but the pain felt good. Natural, like she was finally communicating in the language she was meant to speak. The neighbors found Sarah's car outside the Fletcher house 3 days later. But Sarah was nowhere to be seen. The authorities searched every room, but found only fresh scratches covering walls that had already been covered in scratches. But these new marks were different. They included Sarah's name alongside Robert, Helen, and the children. 5 names scratched over and over in intricate patterns that seemed to pulse with satisfaction. The house was condemned and boarded up, but the scratching continued. Neighbors reported the sounds growing stronger during winter months, when the walls contracted and creaked. Sometimes they could hear voices mixed in with the scratching. 5 distinct voices, all working together to carve their messages into wood and plaster. Teenagers who dared each other to break into the abandoned farmhouse found walls covered in fresh scratches that formed coherent messages. Always the same invitation: join our family, learn our language, scratch with us forever. Most ran away, but some stayed longer, fascinated by the intricate patterns and the hypnotic rhythm of scratching that seemed to come from inside the walls themselves. Those teenagers were found days later, their fingernails grown long and their hands bloody from clawing at every surface they could reach. They spoke in whispers about the Fletcher family and how the scratching felt like coming home. The house still stands, though the county has tried to demolish it multiple times. Work crews report that their tools break against walls that seem harder than normal wood, and the scratching starts as soon as they begin working, so loud and insistent that most refuse to continue. Local records show that the Fletcher property has been sold 17 times since 1916. Each new owner arrives with plans to restore the farmhouse and make it livable again. Each owner disappears within a month, leaving behind only fresh scratches and the echo of fingernails dragging across wood. But the scratches tell a different story. They speak of a family that grows larger with each new arrival, names carved into walls with loving precision, messages of welcome and belonging that promise belonging to anyone lonely enough to listen. The latest owner bought the property just last month. A young woman from Chicago, recently divorced, looking for a fresh start in the country. The real estate agent tried to warn her about the house's history, but she insisted the stories were just superstition. Her name is Jennifer, and according to the scratches that appeared on the walls the night she signed the papers, the Fletcher family is very excited to meet her. The scratching started again last week. Neighbors report sounds that continue all night, rhythmic and purposeful, like multiple people working together on some massive project that requires infinite patience and precision. Drive past the Fletcher farmhouse on Elm Creek Road, and you might see lights moving behind the boarded windows. Stop and listen carefully, and you'll hear the scratching. Dozens of fingernails working in perfect harmony, carving messages of welcome and invitation into walls that have already been carved so many times the wood should have crumbled to dust. But the house stands strong, held together by something more powerful than nails or boards, held together by the desperate need of a family that refuses to let death separate them from the people they love. The scratches are still spreading. Each year, they appear on more surfaces throughout the county. Barns, schools, even the courthouse downtown have found mysterious marks appearing overnight. Always the same message, written in the Fletcher family's distinctive script. Always the same invitation to join something larger than yourself. The question isn't whether the Fletcher family is still alive in some impossible way. The question is whether you would have the strength to resist their offer if they chose you to be their next addition. Because somewhere in Iowa, fingernails are still scratching against wood, still carving messages of welcome and belonging, still adding new names to a family roster that grows longer every year. And if you listen closely on quiet nights, you might hear them scratching your name into the walls of your own home, preparing space for one more person who understands that some families are too strong to be broken by something as simple as death. The scratching never stops in Elm Creek. It only gets louder when it finds someone new to welcome home. And tonight, as you settle into bed in your own house, you might want to listen carefully to the walls around you, because the Fletcher family has learned that distance means nothing when you're carving messages of love and belonging.
They've learned that any wall can become a door.
Any house can become home. Any family can be made complete, whether the new members want to join or not.